Welcome to Understand Suicide, the podcast of journalist and therapist Paola Fontanelli. Since her father's suicide in 2005, Paola has dedicated her life to breaking the silence around this most stigmatized of subjects. Her book, Understanding Suicide, Living with Loss, Paths to Prevention, was nominated for the National Book Award in Brazil, and the English edition is now available on Amazon.
My guest today is Cuban. She's been in America for over 30 years. Her name is Marti Diaz Domm. Absolutely love your name, I have to say that.
Thank you.
She has been working in schools and as an educator for more than 20 years, as a teacher for 13, and as a vice principal and principal for 7 with kids from the ages of 6 to 14. So welcome to my podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to start talking to you, and just so our listeners know, she has been working within the Oregon educational system. And I heard the other day, I was listening to this teacher talk about, she was actually talking about social media and how kids today with this hyper-connectivity and being on their phones all the time, and how it has shifted when it comes to mental health in schools from cases of kids in the past, this is what she said, in the past they would have cases of ADHD, they would have kids with depression a little bit, but mostly with problems at home with parents or with bullying. And now, because of the phone and these kids having to check their phones all the time and all that social media has brought, that there has been a huge shift in mental health, and kids now are so anxious. Anxiety has just taken over. Is that your experience, Marti?
Well, I started as an educator in 1998, and back then there were no iPhones. There were none of the iPads and other things that kids have today as the norm. They did not exist back then. So bullying or whatever stressors the kids have came from home or in the playground, kids passing notes about other kids. I did see a progression as in the year 2000, after the technology exploded by the year 2008. Mm-hmm. A lot of kids were getting phones and technology that it was something called MySpace. That's how it began. Kids mm-hmm. were on MySpace, and even though the website said that they should be 14 years of age or 18 years of age and have parent consent, that was not the case. So that's when I began to notice a shift in the way kids began to communicate. They were communicating not by conversation, but they were actually communicating via technology. And I saw kids more and more wanting to be in the computer room in the schools and less wanting to be outside playing games and being active. Mm-hmm. And kids, the more kids exercise and the more kids are able to run and be active outside, it does help them cognitively in the classroom.
It does.
It clarifies everything for them. They're able to, whatever energies they had from lunch or energies from the day, they're able to work that out. But in the last years that I was as an educator, I noticed that teachers and because we do live in Oregon and it rains here a lot of the kids would opted out of playing in the covered area of mm-hmm. the playground where they could still play and be active even though it was raining, but they opted out to be in the computer lab and having access to the technology because that was an option for them to take if they wanted mm-hmm. it. So I did see an increase. And then as the years progressed, and I would say after 2010, 2011, more and more kids brought their technology to school in the forms of an iPhone or Android or whatever. So and those phones are actually little computers. You could to school, everything. So I did see an increase in kids coming to school with adult-like technology that their parents would provide for them because they asked for them. So,
do you think that it had an impact on their mental health, or maybe in the way they related to each other?
Well, what happened was what happened when the last years that I was an educator. A lot of kids had fake Instagram accounts, for example, and they would find ways of little groups to bully each other. Say things, because you could say something in the computer, or you could say something in your phone that you didn't necessarily would ever dare say in front of a person's face.
And since it's not a real account, so they would not be identified.
Correct.
Either.
Yeah. And so I saw an increase of kids going to the counselor's office, telling the teachers that they were being bullied or they were being harassed. And then the years progressed and technology even got more sophisticated with things like Snapchat, where kids were actually filming things that they thought would eventually disappear into the space. But they were actually taking shots of that, and it was being shared in the school. So it became a really big problem. Some teachers wanted to have rules where the kids would check in their phones at the beginning of the day. But that became problematic with not only the kids, but it became problematic with their parents who didn't want their phones taken from them.
Well, but that's a good point that you just made, because we tend to talk about the kids and what they do, but if you have the parents complaining, then what can you do as an educator? And what we have seen, unfortunately, the latest statistics on suicide, you might have seen this, that it's been rising in all ages. But the age group that really, for me, was astounding when I looked at the numbers was from the ages of 10 to 14, it tripled in 10 years, the number of suicides. So that's huge. And I was just wondering if that was something that you also experienced. Do you think that schools are now, they are well equipped? Do they have people trained to talk about mental illness with the kids and to handle it properly?
So the schools are funded with what they call FTE, which is the principals are provided with a budget. There were times where a school that was in the inner city, which is a Title I school, would have to share a counselor between two elementary schools or two, and in the middle schools they get their own school counselor. But there was a time when I was working at Beaverton, for example, that a Title I school, which means that they have over a certain amount of percentage free and reduced lunch, which means a lot of the kids that go there are within the poverty line. So these are kids that are coming to school with a backpack full of emotional bricks because they have parents that are working very hard, new immigrants, and they come with a great deal to school to begin with. And so now you have teachers that are trained to teach a curriculum. Teachers are not trained to deal with mental issues. There's not one class, and I have a master's of education. In my master's, there was not one class that had to do with psychology or anything like that.
That's surprising. I had no idea.
Yeah, and so the teachers, when a kid is in dire emotional need, what they do is they send that kid with a pass to the counselor. Well, one of the elementary schools, and that's a K through 5th grade, I was the principal of a school that had close to 700 kids.
And one counselor.
So can you imagine? And this was a Title I school. And
what does that mean, just so our listener, if they don't know?
A Title I school is a school where federal monies are allocated to them because the majority of the kids live below the poverty line.
I see. Okay.
So the principals afforded federal funding to provide things like a full-time counselor. In a K-5, which is an elementary, age 5 to 11 or 12, right? Schools do not have to have a counselor full-time. The schools do not have to have a counselor full-time. So the counselor, even if you have 600 kids, will only be there half-time. But when you are a Title I school, you get extra money from the state, from the government, from the federal government, and then you're able to have an FTE, which is like a person in the school that's just a counselor.
So walk me through it. Let's say I'm a child, I'm 13 years old, and I'm having problems maybe with my parents, and I come to school and I say, I'm having, of course, usually what happens is you see behavioral problems, right? So the teacher knows that there is something going on. What happens then?
Well, the teachers in our school systems, for the most part, are very good people that really became teachers because they wanted to make an impact on tomorrow's future. So most teachers are dedicated, hardworking, and they really want to teach their kids. Unfortunately, they're provided a curriculum that they have to teach to. The principal is told by the district that this is the curriculum that their teachers have to follow. So the teachers are given this curriculum. They are assessed or evaluated on how well their kids do on a test. So the teachers are said, this is what you have to teach.
They're under a lot of pressure.
They're under a lot of pressure. So I want to make sure that you listeners know that the teachers of Oregon are doing their best they can with the limited amount of support that they have.
But what kind of support would they have? I mean, what could they do for the child in that situation?
Well, their hand is behind their back when it comes to a child because they have, at one time when I was a teacher at Beaverton, I had 37 kids in one classroom. So if you have 37 second graders or third graders, and you were the only adult in the room, and you have one kid that has an emotional issue, your first thing to do is you ask for help from either the vice principal, the principal, or in most cases, the person that should help the kid or the student is the counselor. But what if you don't have a counselor in the school?
Yeah.
And if you do have a counselor, the counselors are licensed by TSPC, which is the body that actually is the regulatory body that regulates teachers, which means a counselor, a school counselor, is considered an educator.
I see.
They're not monitored. Their license is not monitored by a counseling license. Therefore, they're taught, their programs do have some emotional aspects to it, some psychological aspects to it, but they don't really know how to counsel kids. A lot of the time, they're just putting Band-Aids on the situation at school.
What about suicide? Do you get any training in suicide, for example, identifying the warning signs and what to do?
I didn't get any suicide. We do get a training at the beginning of the year that has to do with child abuse, and it has to do with what do you do when you believe that a child is being abused by either an adult, another child, a teacher, but we don't necessarily get any kind of training that deals with suicide at school and the school system, especially in the K-5 school system. Now, with the increased anxiety that kids are coming in, there's programs that the school systems are buying. Like, for example, we used to use something called First Steps. That's kind of a psychological curriculum that the counselor would teach in the classroom about bullying and what to do when you're feeling anxiety or depression. But it is just a curriculum that follows a certain amount. It's assuming that all kids are the same in the classroom, but all kids come differently.
So nothing specifically about suicide?
No.
So what, in your opinion, should change? Do you have any, for those who are listening to us, maybe they're educators themselves, and what can they do and what needs to change in the system so that mental health becomes a priority?
Well, I think we should help our teachers. What I mean by that is help very hard-working individuals, being that we know that their skill set is in teaching the classroom. Most teachers do build relationships with their students, but they have little to no education in therapeutic or counseling. So I believe that it would be amazing if some schools would have funding to actually have a mental health counselor, like a licensed counseling person, whether it is an MSW or an LPC, in the actual school, working alongside with the school counselor to provide extra mental health for all students.
More support and even guidance.
Yeah.
The person could maybe train the teachers to spot some of these warning signs, for example, when it comes to suicide.
Yeah, because I believe as a teacher, I did all I could for the students, and as an administrator the same. My job was to support the teachers. And the counselor, when you have one counselor for 700 kids, what therapeutic assistance can she provide?
Of course, yeah.
So,
and as you said, I mean, if the teacher identifies that there is one child who needs assistance, she would take or he would take them to the vice principal or to the principal, who are not trained either.
No.
So they're on their own. All
Correct.
of them. So it's a very dire situation for everyone, not just the kids.
Yeah.
Because there's liability too, and I'm sure that as an educator, it's very frustrating for you to see that someone needs help and you really can't do much.
Yeah, and you don't have what it takes to truly help kids who are in mental health, with kids with mental health issues that need more than just a caring teacher and a caring counselor.
If you want more information about suicide, my book is now available on Amazon, both in paperback and digital formats. Just type in the title, Understanding Suicide, or my name, Paula Fontinelli. The book was written for people like you, and it's the result of more than 10 years of conversations with families who lost loved ones to suicide, individuals who attempted suicide, specialists, and mental health professionals. Thank you for your support. Now back to the interview.
Imagine if you had 700 clients or 700 people coming into your doors on a daily basis wanting to see a counselor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what a school counselor has to deal with. And yet, they're not supposed to do one-on-one counseling.
Mm-hmm.
They go into the classrooms to teach things, like I said before, first steps, which is a curriculum that has to do with bullying
Mm-hmm.
prevention. They do girls club, or they do girls or boys lunches with the
Mm-hmm.
boys. But that's not one-on-one counseling, and that's what the school system needs.
Yeah, but at least if you, as you said, if you had someone there who were trained, in the case of suicide, for example, if they identified that it was maybe the child was already planning suicide or was having suicidal ideation, at least they would know what to do, where to send them for proper care. So that would make a difference.
That would. I was surprised in my last position as a principal, the amount of young girls and young boys that came to the office with the counselor to tell us. The counselor would come with the student to tell us that they were thinking of hurting themselves, and of course we would have to call the crisis line. That's what what we had to do, was call the crisis line, and then the crisis line would visit the parents to see what assistance what assistance could be provided, but then that you taking the school out of that. So the school removes itself. So what happens is, if a child comes to you and says, I'm thinking of hurting myself,
or taking my own life,
what that teacher does, they send that student to the counselor. The counselor then comes to the principal. Together, they come up with a safety plan that the counselor works on. Then we have to call the crisis center. We have to inform the parents because the school doesn't want to be liable. If a student says that they're going to kill themselves, the counselor has to tell them.
Because they're minors, so the parents, they need to know. And that's very tricky too. I understand the law, and I understand that it's a matter of, acknowledging the problem, and the parents need to know. But what if the parents are a source of problem? For example, what if there is abuse? What if there is sexual abuse, or if there is neglect, or there is a problem like substance use? So what do you do then? I mean, that's a very tricky.
So that's the training that all teachers and administrators take at the beginning of the year. So you're isolating again the education system. So what the teacher has to do, because we're first reporters. So if a teacher thinks that a child has a black eye, or if a teacher believes that a child is being abused in any way, in any form of abuse, whatever that might be, anywhere from the spectrum of verbal abuse all the way up to physical abuse or sexual abuse, the teacher, the first thing she has to do per her license is that she has to call DHS.
They have to report it.
Yes, they have to call DHS, and DHS will send out a investigator right away if they deem it. They usually tell the teacher or the principal, do not let the child go home. We're sending a social worker to the school. And the social worker works. They take the child to an office to ask him or her questions. The administrator is not involved at that point. Now the school is no longer.
So it's out of your hands.
It's
basically.
Out of our hands. It's like the DHS just takes the ball, and because it's not our job to investigate abuse.
Of course not, yeah.
So DHS is the one that does it. They take care of it, and we do not. Seldomly do we know what the outcome is of that investigation.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking and you did have a case of suicide. You did lose a student. You told me, and it was a very very difficult case too, because in that case it was a cultural thing. It had something the involvement of parents in a way in what he was going through, and he came to you for help. And I remember you told me, and if you can just tell the story, of course we won't use the right name to protect the child, but there was some cultural issues and some problems with the family itself. And how did you deal with that?
This was when I was I was not a principal. I was the vice principal of a school, and one of my students was getting into trouble. He believed that he was a gay man. He was also from another culture, Asian culture. And so he did not want to disappoint his parents, and he was an immigrant, and it was in his opinion, being gay was not an option for him, and he didn't want anyone to tell his parents. And so since he was 14 at the time, so he was at the age where we can protect him to some degree. If he would have been younger and he would have come to a school, a teacher or a vice principal like I was, or a counselor, and he was, say, 12, then we would have had to tell his parents. But because
in Oregon, the law allows you, when you're 14, then you don't have to.
You don't necessarily have to. If you think that the child being forced to come out, and he lives or she lives in a home where that would not be accepted, he is able or she's able to have a bit of leeway as to
confidentiality.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what the counselor, which was amazing, the counselor and myself worked with the student, and we created a safety plan, and he got in touch with an organization in Portland that helps LBGT youth, and they get them free services, free counseling, and he was a part of that program.
Mm-hmm. So in that case, because of his age, it was possible for you not to involve the parents, because that was the main thing for him, wasn't it?
Yes. I mean, if he would have, to him, involving his father, he came from a country where being gay, according to him, his father would have taken him back to his country of birth, and it's legal in that country to kill your child if you think that they're gay or lesbian.
Wow.
You know, it's still actually till today it is legal for certain countries in the Middle East to kill or to isolate or to put away.
You mean institutionalized?
Yeah, I mean
If
put him.
if they're gay?
Yeah. So
Mhm.
he was very afraid that if he did come out to his parents, or if his parents, especially his father, he was the only son. He had 3 or 4 sisters. I'm not sure how many sisters she had, but he was the only son. He was afraid that that would be a major blow to his father, and his mode of thinking was that his father would take him back to his place of birth, where he would either be isolated somewhere or he would be killed. And it's legal in his country to
So
do
was
that.
it helpful for him
Helpful for...
to get counseling? And
Yeah, it was very helpful. And then there came a point where he graduated from middle school, and then we provided all the safety plans that the counselor had, which was like the counselor created a safety plan for him, and he safely moved into the high school, the next level, and he was very successful the first year in high school. I believe that in the following year, the counselor would meet, because the middle school counselors work very closely with high school counselors
Yes.
in passing the baton, if you.
Uh-huh.
So one of the things that he wanted to do was to join the Gay Straight Alliance at the high school. The high schools now have gay straight alliances, and he was really interested, but then he became fearful that someone would see him, a cousin, or someone would see him come out of the meeting room that they would meet at lunchtime.
I see.
And he was so fearful that someone would see him come out of the meeting, and
That's so sad.
Yeah.
I mean, to live like that.
Yeah, and so that was the biggest. At that point, I had, not that I lost touch with him, but the counselor told me that he did great that first year in high school, and it was the second year that became more problematic. I think, and I'm not sure about this, it was because he had a crush on another boy, a young man in the high school,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when things became worse for him.
Mm-hmm.
When he actually didn't know how he would act on his feelings. That was because in the meantime, when he was just in middle school, he was able to hold the feelings. He didn't have to act on them.
Mm-hmm.
But when he went on to high school, he befriended another gay boy,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when feelings came up for him, came out of him, and he
And,
just
and of course, with it, the fear too, because
Yeah.
it was more risky.
Yeah, and just like in all high school,
Of
if
course,
you're
yeah.
going to a high school, kids have crushes on one another, and kids are boyfriend and girlfriend.
As they should.
Yeah, and there's more. I think they have freedoms. They could, especially when you are. Some high schools allow you to go out to lunch. You don't have to stay in the campus.
Mm-hmm.
Some high schools say, well, when you're a junior, you could go and have You don't have to stay in the school cafeteria. You could go in the surrounding area businesses to have lunch. So there's a great deal of freedom in high school that he did not have when he was just in grammar school.
And also, I think for him, maybe the contrast too of having all that freedom and going back to a home where he did feel he was accepted as, for who he was.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he died.
Yeah.
From what you said.
Yeah, he did. It was sad. He did. He was successful in his suicide. But it's a very sad case for me because I believe it all was preventable. For this young man, it was not necessarily technology as much as it was being truthful and being afraid. So being so very afraid to come out.
And not being able to be yourself.
Yeah. And at the age of 16, which I think that's what he was, at the age of 16, to be able to not be able to express yourself, just like any 16-year-old boy or girl, they express themselves. You see kids in high school holding hands, and it's very normal.
Yeah.
And
it was too much for him.
It was. So yes, it's hard. It was hard for people, his friends, and when I heard about it, it was very sad as well.
How did you deal with it? How did you?
It was one of the things that I started. I got enrolled in the university here, George Fox, and I only did it as a part-time thing, just getting credits to. After I'm finished with education, I could help kids. But then it became really like it's really needed, like mental health. It's not that it doesn't want to be, that people in schools don't want to address it. It's just that it's not being funded properly.
I see.
I'm not pointing fingers, because as someone that was a teacher, the teachers are doing magnificent things with what tools they're given.
Mm-hmm.
The administrators, even if they wanted to hire an LPC or a social worker, they're not funded. So even if a principal wanted to have mental health prevention and mental health, more than just because the school counselor is so busy, and as I said, they're not licensed by mental health. They're licensed as a teacher.
I see.
So having that extra person that works with the counselor and the teacher, and having
extra support,
having wraparound services around the whole child, not just provide. It was frustrating for me as an educator many times when I would be given grants and I would be given monies to have a $75,000 brand new computer lab that could be used for testing. But that money, if I could have used it to hire a full-time
mental health professional, could have been much more important.
Yeah.
So what are your plans for the future? You are changing careers. You're finishing your master's in counseling.
Yeah.
Do you want to go back to the school system?
No, I don't want to go back to the school system. I think it's being taken care of by better and people that are ready for it right now. I think I'm done with that.
But even as a counselor, do you want to work in schools?
No.
You're done with the system?
I'm done with working in the school. I wouldn't mind partnering up with schools.
Yes.
I
because I'm sure you would do a great job. I mean, you know this population better than anyone I know.
I would love to partner up with schools and teachers. I would want to work with community center that works with kids in need.
Mm-hmm. But you will still work with kids.
Oh, yes.
Not in schools, but that's your population of choice.
Yeah, that is. And I also clearly want to work with the LBGT community, kids coming out.
They
Even
really
though
need it.
now it's easier to come out and there's things now that were not available back when. It is still a very hard journey. I'm sure that you
yes,
know
the
this.
suicide rates are much higher in LGBTQ. Yeah.
So I would like to work with those two communities. I like to work with everybody, but those are my the two communities that I feel it's more pressing that I work with.
Okay, I'm sure you do a great job. Thank you so much for your time, for your experience and knowledge. Thanks for sharing with us.
You're very welcome.
You've been listening to Understand Suicide, the podcast of journalist and therapist Paola Fontanelli. If you've been touched by suicide and believe your story might help others, please consider contacting Paola through her website, understandsuicide.com.